Good evening and welcome to the Grace Talk. I am Gloria Godson. Thank you for joining us today. We are continuing a discussion that we started last week on reparations and whether African Americans should be paid reparations for slavery. Last week, we read from Deuteronomy 15, from verse 12 to 15, where God said, if you release a slave, you should not send him away empty-handed. You should provide him with resources. The Bible also talks in Corinthians about restitution as a part of healthy reconciliation and healing. Today, we are going to continue that conversation. And once again, we have assembled a fabulous panel to engage in this discussion today. But as always, we want you, our audience, to please engage with us. Make comments, ask questions, and join the conversation. So now let's go ahead and meet our panelists. Mike Ancona, U.S. Navy submarine veteran, 30-year professional in electric power generation, and currently operations manager at a power station in Philadelphia. Ron Davis, who works in the financial industry and was studied again at Wilmington University. Louis Fevrin, owner of the Louis Fevrin Insurance Agency. Jay Cofield. Jay has a bachelor's degree in psychology and marriage counseling. He is completing his master's degree in clinical mental health. And Joyce Most. Joyce is a poet, she is a writer, she is former educator and coordinator for Expanding Options. And Joyce, welcome as the second female panelist on this panel. This is big. We have had an all-male cast for a long time, and she has finally broken through the glass ceiling and is here as a female. Of course, I'm joking about that. Welcome, Joyce.
Thank you. It's good to
and
be
I'm
here.
looking forward to your participation today. So gentlemen, last week we ran into some confusion and misconceptions around reparations and what they were and whether it was an entitlement program and all that around white privilege. And the first time that we began this conversation, I level set us with definitions and clarifications. And I think that before we go down this path, this is a very, very complicated conversation and people fall off very easily. So let's be sure that we have a guide and some sort of parameters to have a common understanding of what we're talking about. So I have asked Ron Davis to kick off for us some clarifications. Ron works in the financial services industry and he is very experienced in matters of this sort. So again, Ron, please, would you kick us off today with some clarifications, common understanding, so that we can go into this discussion, hopefully with some cohesion amongst us. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Gloria. First of all, that's not my area of expertise. I'm not sure. That's, I think, more academia than banking that I'm in. But first of all, I'm hoping that we understand that reparation is just the payment for services performed in the past. It's not an entitlement program that would be created. It is something that is owed. It's simple, very simple. None of us get up in the morning, whether we own our own business or we work for a company, but we do not get up every day and go to work for free. We, at the end of every 2 weeks or monthly, you get a paycheck for the work done. And so for the over 40 million African Americans that worked for free, and that number includes the children that were raised here, they automatically, unlike the European system where if the father was free, the child would be born free. The law did not work in that way. It was if you work, you get paid. That's our system. And so based on the wealth that was created, billions of dollars that were created by these folks working for free, there should be some payment made to restitution for the work done. And it might be complicated, but I say what's complicated is putting a man on the moon or putting a vehicle on Mars. That's complicated. This is much easier stuff to sort out in terms of reimbursement.
Thank you, Ron. Again, what Ron is saying, what I'm hearing you say is that people need to think of this not as, government giving a handout to people, that this is what is owed because people went to work, they did work and should be paid for the time that they worked. That's what you're saying.
That is correct.
Okay, let me get your input there, Louis. Actually, today someone had posted a comment on the Greystock page saying, if we're going to pay reparations, then you should deduct this and deduct that, deduct all the amount that was paid for welfare, the phone bills that have been paid, and different on any payment, rental payments, energy payments, you should deduct that. Louis, you made a comment there, so let me hear your thoughts on what Ron had just said.
Well, just to add on to what Ron said, it's not just for the work that was done, it's for the disservice that was done to a group of people as well. And we have historical context as well within this country of disservices being done to a group of people, and there being reparations to those group of people, not just for work that they did, because some of them didn't do any work. Some of them were just encamped, such as the Japanese. They were encamped just for being Japanese Americans at that. They weren't even from, half of them weren't even from, were born in this country, but because of their Japanese heritage, they were encamped while we were at war with them. So there was reparations paid to them because of a disservice that was done to them as a group of people. But to answer your question about the comments that was made, the comment was, again, portraying the fact that the stereotype that Blacks are mostly on welfare or getting some type of government aid, some type of entitlement. I made a clarification about that and stated that there are actually more whites on welfare than Blacks. And you could just look at the census report. Thus, there are more whites actually on entitlement than Blacks. And that's just because as a percentage, there are more whites than Blacks. So, but the stereotype is, about the welfare queen, and again, that comes back to racism and the stereotypes that have been historically portrayed on a group of people. But that being said, welfare is due to a financial hardship because of where they are economically. That's a whole nother system that we can have another discussion about, because the way the system is in place right now, I do believe that it's meant to entrap you and keep you there. It's not a system that's meant to get you out of your hardship, but that's another subject that's separated from reparations. Reparations is due to a disservice that was done to a group of people. And in our particular case, in this particular discussion, free labor, which created tremendous wealth and power to a country in every field. Every field within this country benefited off of slavery, and wealth was created for, various industries. Every industry that started in this country was due to slavery, one way or the other. So, given a piece of that pie just to, and again, I'll go back to my original statement. I don't think a dollar amount will solve anything, but the way I look at reparation is a step towards healing. And it's really a step towards healing for everyone, not just for Blacks, but for the country as a whole. to finally admit to a sin, because we have to look at things for what it is. Racism, all of it is a sin. The only way that sin can be defeated is you first have to admit to that sin. If you can't admit to that sin, you can't ask for forgiveness, right? So it's just a step in the process of getting over that, or that original sin of this country, which is, the slavery and the racism behind it.
Thank you, Lois. Joyce, I'm going to ask you to chime in there. We need some female participation here. What are your thoughts to what these gentlemen have just said about reparations in America for African Americans?
So I had some interesting conversations this last week, and I spoke with people in different generations, and I found some very interesting things. A lot of the older ones that I spoke with within the African American community were more about we need to look at making amends for the future. We can't pay for the past, but we have to make amends for the future. But then I also spoke with a very young gentleman, and he was like, well, I think all minorities across the board should get reparations, because you have the Native Americans, you have it, and then we had a very interesting discussion, because I was like, how do you ever expect to figure this out? Because we can't even, during COVID, employment has been a disaster. Taxes are a nightmare. How are we ever going to go back and determine who actually gets a payout? Now, if we're talking specific cash payments versus education, free education, some other different things, but specific cash payments. And he was like, well, we'll just use ancestry.com. And I was like, but ancestry.com doesn't even take you back your family line. And they have discovered in science that you are not 50% your mother, 50% your father. You can be 75 your father, 25 your mother. So where does that all come? And so it's just, we were talking about, I honestly, Abraham Lincoln was shot at a very bad time, because he was actually looking into reparations to take place before he was killed. And when he was killed, everything then got stuck on the back burner, and that never came up again until fairly recently within our history. And I think as far as a cash payment, there is a debt to be owed. There's no denial of that. Anyone that denies that is living in denial of history and reality. But to actually come up with a monetary reparation is something I'm not sure how we could ever figure that out. I want to say Woodson from Woodson Center last year actually said that America atoned for the sin of slavery when, wrong quote. Jason Hickel in the Divide Global Inequity of the Conquest of Free Markets, last year he said, it is estimated that the United States alone benefited from the total of 222,505,49 hours of forced labor between 1619 and the abolition of slavery in 1865, valued at the US minimum wage with a modest rate of interest that is worth $97 trillion today. And I just don't know where it's owed. I'm not, but I'm not sure how in our modern, we're so far removed. I'm not sure how with monetary reparations, like a cash payout, I really am not sure how that would work. I have other suggestions, because there definitely has to be amendments made. There has to be a recognition of what happened. There has to be a recognition of why, because those things happened, we're stuck where we are today. And there has to be a new future made. I'm just totally for a new future. But I'm not sure with being so far removed with, and then we were talking about, well, then where do you draw the line? When do you decide, where someone was free and where someone was not free, where, do we then pay the Irish slaves? Do we then pay land real estate to the Native Americans then for the land that we've stolen. It's a quagmire. And so if someone has a very simple solution, I would love to hear it, but for me, the more I look into it, the more it just got murkier and murkier for a cash payout.
Thank you, Joyce. And again, let's, for now, and you're right, this is not an easy solution by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
But again, let's focus on what I heard from you is that definitely reparations, you believe that they are owed, but how to get from here to there is a concern. And many of the concerns that you raised were about cash reparations, which is again another bucket. So let's put that aside, but thank you for your comments. Let me go to you now, Mike. What are your thoughts about this and the comments that you've heard so far?
Well, my thoughts are a lot like my thoughts were last week. I think it's worth looking into.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, if reparations were on the government's docket after the Civil War, just because Abraham Lincoln got shot doesn't mean, okay, well, I guess we're not doing that now. I mean, we should have done it then. Let's look into what we can do now. Having said that, Joyce, it's going to be difficult, not impossible, but difficult. Now, when it comes to government, I'm a bit of a cynic. I believe, and I don't have any data, but I've just been around long enough to know that this concept will be just another tool of politics that will be dangled out in front of a voting block as long as they possibly can for votes. That's everything about what I've seen in the years that I've been following politics tells me that that's exactly how it's going to be happening. People won't see a dime of that money or anything else, but it will be promised, and it'll be promised, and it'll be promised, and it'll be promised by this group and that group. That's just what I think is going to happen. I could be wrong, and I hope I am wrong. But something tells me that this would just be another thing that would be used to try to convince a group of people to vote a certain way.
Thank you, Mike. Jay, what are your thoughts? You've heard all the conversation, and what are your thoughts around this issue? Should African Americans be paid reparations? And then let's not talk about what form of reparations. The question is, should there be reparations?
In short, most certainly. I do agree with what has come forth thus far in terms of how these reparations should be paid. It is very difficult to understand because to consider, what it means to receive a reparation means some form of repair, is being done. And when you look at the state of African Americans, in our current climate, so many generations have been destroyed and lost. It's hard to imagine any monetary value that would repair the damage that has been done. So I do think what Joyce had mentioned in terms of making reparations more geared toward the future, what will come from this point forward. I was always taught that a parent's revelation of God or our revelation is our children's foundation. And to think now collectively as Americans who are recognizing that Black people are owed a reparation and so much has been done to the Black family. What can we collectively do to build a stronger foundation for Black families moving forward? I would be 100% in agreement with reparations that are geared toward that cause.
Thank you, Jay. I think one of the things that really struck me was, I think it was Lewis that said something that got me going, and that is, I forget how you said it, Lewis, but my interpretation of it is a question of justice. It's a question of justice, and a grave injustice has been done. Everyone agrees that a grave injustice has been done. sometimes, this reparations is really just an acknowledgement that you were mistreated. Somehow, I don't know that it's about the money for many people. And again, we can talk about what form it takes. And, but the fact is an acknowledgement nationally that this was wrong, and is important to the healing process. The Bible talks about restitution. When you've done something wrong, a step is to do what you can to make it right. It doesn't repair and obliterate the wrong, but at least is a sincere effort to show I truly am sorry, I recognize I'm wrong, and this is my token step to make this right. So for me, that's a question. Again, justice is something that just resonates very strongly with me. It has an injustice been done? That's a question. And for me, someone asked me a question during this week that really struck a chord, which is, if we were to say that agree that Japanese Americans deserve reparations, how is it that African Americans don't? If someone can help clarify that, how is it that African Americans don't deserve reparations when Japanese Americans were given reparations for internment camps and African Americans endured generations of slavery? How could it be possible, if you're being just, that you see that reparations should be paid for one and not the other? And then the person capped it with this question: if it was any other race, would we even be having this conversation? Would we even, if it was any other race of people in America, would we even be having this conversation? So let me ask you a question, Ron, coming back to you. I circulated an article that was sent to me about reparations. We're talking about it theoretically, but there is a city that has taken the bold step to enact reparations. So why don't you kick us off on that discussion? I hope everyone had an opportunity to read the article. But Ron, talk to us, because there are different structures. One of the things that we've at least heard on this panel is most people think an injustice was done, some sort of repair needs to be done. But, Joyce has, I think she said it very eloquently, financial, reparations, cash, payments. Both Joyce and Mike said that last week as well, is a challenge. So Ron, why don't you kick off and talk about what Asheville, North Carolina did?
So I don't know if you had the chance to read it or not, but before I get to that, Joyce, there was a representative from the state of Michigan, John Conyers, who for 30 years, he wrote a bill which he tried to get the House to review, not making reparation, but researching reparation for 30 years, and every year it was never taken up. 30 years. He's dead and gone now, so it just goes to show there's a resistance to any form to even considering it. And I joined with some of the other panels in saying, hey, it's and I think Louis made it quite clear as well, until we can acknowledge as a nation that yes, this was wrong to take almost 13 million people from their homeland, rape their mothers, the wives, the women, and all the injustice that this was done. Until we get to that point, it's going to be tough for healing to take place. So having said that, the city of Asheville in North Carolina passed a resolution on reparation. And sometimes we get stuck, but on cash payment. Okay, but there are other forms of reparation, and their resolution starts up by saying, whereas Black people have been unjustly enslaved. So there's the acknowledgement. Mm-hmm. And whereas the Black people have been unjustly segregated, there's another acknowledgement. And whereas Black people have been unjustly incarcerated. And so it starts out there. So let's look at some of the things that, before we even get to cash payment, that could be resolved easily. Their children right now who are going to school, I think they're using books when President Kennedy was president in this country. They're African-American school. They're going back to improper, let's say the classroom, the structure, nothing is in place which will allow them to succeed. Not impossible, but it's very improbable. So how about starting there? Let's restructure the school system where we provide these African-American with decent schooling. How about hospitals in their neighborhood? We talk about reparations. How about the segregation, informative segregation? Right now, depending on where you live, typically based on the fact that African-American, well, in general, have been placed in these red line areas, wherein the property, a similar house in a different neighborhood it's certainly worth maybe 50% the value. Why? Because the structure was set up in terms of insurance, not insurable. If you live in a Black neighborhood, your car insurance is probably twice as high. Let's start with breaking down the structure before we even get to talking about the cash payment. How about dealing with, my thing is that let's deal with some of these things. The incarceration. Right now, the proportion of African Americans, you don't have to do anything to be incarcerated. Because most of the folks in jail just end up, if the police officer said you did it, unfortunately now we have cameras to prove that sometimes you were innocent. I'm not saying everybody is innocent, but now there are other opportunities. How about let's looking at some of those issues? School scholarships, job opportunities. And Dr. King said, I have a dream. We're still waiting on the dream where we're judged by the content of our character. How about our education? Given an opportunity, a fair opportunity. We might go in with the same type of, or I might be more qualified than someone else, and I lose the job because I don't get the job because of the color of my skin. So how about starting there? Restructuring racism in the sense of denying mortgage, not being able to live in certain neighborhoods. If we were to break these barriers down, then that would be a start. That would be a way you could easily fight crime. The government says, well, we're fighting crime. Okay, well, given opportunity, a lot of these folks would not be doing the stuff that they're doing. It's because there's a lack of opportunity. So that's, Joyce, is where I would say we could start, even before we talk about cash payment, because that in itself is not the only issue.
Thank you. And again, that's right in line with Asheville, North Carolina. I think there's some of the things that were promoted there were, home ownerships, opportunities, business loans, things like that, that do not involve cash payment. Joyce, I see you nodding vigorously. Do you have any comments there?
Yes, I actually brought up the cash payments because honestly, when people hear the word, that's usually where they go. So that's why I addressed that first. I 100% agree with what Ron had to say. I have two nephews. They're both super intelligent. They're both super talented. One is Black, one is white. Their life paths are different, and it should not be simply because of the things that are, and I have been in education. And so education is near and dear to my heart. We had affirmative action that was supposed to work, right? But then we found out that we weren't providing the education to some of these people so that they're there to take the positions. We found a lot of different things. And so education is very near and dear to my heart. People that are put in prison who now can no longer vote simply for something because of the color of their skin. So we're actually working politically almost in a way, not just in imprisonment. Housing is huge. I lived for 5 years in Alabama. The Jim Crow laws may no longer have been on the books, but I'll tell you what, they learned a way how to do it. I mean, it was disgusting to me when an application would come in and depending what the name was, it would go in the trash. I mean, that is so wrong. We have to identify, we have to acknowledge, and we have to voice the sins that have taken place in this country and are still taking place, unfortunately. I wish it would not be that way, but it is the way it is. And it's very true. We're never going to get healing until the original hurt and pain is acknowledged. That's the only way you can even begin. And I don't think that's ever officially been done. You'll get little pieces of it, like in North Carolina, you'll get little pieces here and there maybe, or a certain church will put out a statement or, but there has never been an official acknowledgement of what's happened. And I totally agree with Ron. I think there are ways that we can do reparations, that we can try and amend. First, you have to make the acknowledgement, but then you need to step up with your actions, not just your words. And we have to find reparations in areas that we can make things so that the future generations may not have to face some of these things that all these generations have had to face and even more. It's just, I just agree 100%. That was well said, Ron.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. What we're hearing is that, from at least on this panel, people think that an injustice was done to African Americans. It needs to be acknowledged. And one of the main ways of acknowledging is to pay reparations. Now, where we are is that cash reparations is not what we're looking at right now. There are reparations that can be put in place. And even if you look at what happened in Germany, Germany put in place reparations, but again, reparations that targeted different areas to bring resolution and healing and move people forward. Jay said that everyone basically said that, let's focus on making sure that we don't repeat in the future the mistakes of the past, and that the next generation of African Americans do not labor under the same burden that their fathers and mothers labored. So let me ask you, Jay, why don't you chime in there? Do you have any thoughts around this?
Actually, I do. I too agree with Joyce and concerning what Ron brought out, because I know my own personal experience when it comes to schooling. My wife is a teacher and she teaches special education in one of Delaware's highest paid school districts. And I studied some of their habits in terms of the books that they offer their children. And if they go through a school year, and at the end of that school year, they get rid of the books and buy all new books for the next school year. Now, we've had the privilege of having her work in a Wilmington school district where, like Ron mentioned, all of the school books were grossly outdated. And I was thinking to myself, why wouldn't those schools who are in a position financially to buy new materials year in and year out donate some of that material to areas that are, less privileged? And it just goes back into the system of, racism and how it's implemented. I had shared before on the panel how it was for me moving from Philadelphia into Delaware and automatically having all of my grades be disqualified and having to repeat a grade without failing anything, simply because the curriculum that I was taking in Philadelphia wasn't up to snuff with the new curriculum in Delaware. And, as a child, I never understood how that could be, but even as I watch it now, I gained custody of my nephew. I got him from Chester, PA, and brought him into Delaware. And it's really, clear to me that certain education is only available for certain people. You know, certain areas are only looked at to produce certain things. You know, where he's from, if you were a mechanic or, you know, a carpenter or a plumber, you have reached the top. You know, you're considered, you have a good job. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those professions, but you know better to dare to aspire to be anything, you know, more than that. It's almost like the mindset of the community is, you know, you're not going to college, get a trade. You know, you're going to do trade work. To be able to work with your hands is, you know, the top. And not, like I said, that there's anything wrong with wanting to work with your hands and learning a trade. But when you think about systematically what's happening to the mindset of you know, young Black children, you know, we are reproducing that mindset over and over. We want to be an entertainer. We want to be the handy guy. You know, we want to be a rapper or an athlete. But because that's what our, you know, education is telling us, what our areas are giving us to aspire to be. And I think if we could repair the image of what it means to be an African American, you know, if we could begin to build that understanding in our children in the form of updated school materials. I definitely, I'm 100% in agreement with the cost of tuition. You know, because so many of us feel that in order to be able to compete, you know, we take on this college debt to get an education to be seen as equal or competent, only to still be met with, you know, racism and bias. So when Ron, you know, spoke about those two issues, they really hit home for me because it's something that I'm experiencing myself, you know, and trying to offer my children something more in terms of helping them to think out of the box, having to take them out of my neighborhood to find, you know, a school for them to get a better education, but still while giving them the understanding that they're going to face bias or you know, be discriminated against is very disheartening for me. So when I had mentioned, you know, making a repair or reparations that will affect the future, because, you know, whatever has happened, once you acknowledge it, most people are going to say, you know, well, slavery was wrong. If you're a logical and a moral person, you can say to enslave anyone against their will is wrong. And yes, it's gratifying to hear that that was wrong. But now what do we do about the wrong? You know, and we can't go back and mend what happened in the past. But what needs to be focused on now is our children. You know, because most of the things that any of us have experienced on this panel, when I say any of us, I mean, you know, white and Black alike, when you face racism, it's because nothing was ever done about it. But whatever we do about it in the present, more likely than not, won't heal every wound that we felt during our lifetime. But the one joy that we can have is knowing that our children won't suffer the same fate. And I think education is so key.
Thank you. Very well said. And I really enjoy that perspective, that millennial perspective, because that's something that's critical. Looking at it, you're living it and you're breathing it. And that's a perspective that's very helpful. Mike, I want you to chime in here. What are your thoughts on this? How can we structure this to benefit, again, the future and make things better for African Americans going into the future?
No, I'm not sure. I'm listening to everybody, and my mind is in two different places. And one place, it's like, man, I don't know how you're ever going to solve this riddle. And then there's another part of me that's like, well, I know ultimately what the answer has to be. From a political, like if I look at it through the prism of politics in this country and just like governing and how the world works, I don't have a good answer. You know, I don't know. You know, I don't know enough about government. I don't know enough about, I have no idea why a school would throw away textbooks after 1 year. I got to get into that system to even understand why would you do that? That doesn't make any sense to me. So there's a lot that I can't really speak to. It certainly sounds like none of that makes any sense. But, I don't have a kid in the school system. And when my son was in the school system, of course, as you know, Gloria, he's special needs. So he was in a whole other sort of realm anyway, so I don't know. I don't know how to solve this thing from a geopolitical government type of thing. I don't think it can be solved. I just don't. I don't have any confidence in the government's ability to make it right. I just don't think they're going to do it. I would be glad to be wrong, but I just don't see it happen. Having said all that, you and I both know that ultimately, regardless of what condition a person may be in, anybody who turns to God and puts his faith in Jesus Christ has an instant leg up on the competition. But that's a different conversation, and we can go there, but that's not what we're talking about right now. I just don't have a good feel for what do you do because the government's broken in so many places. Like Jay mentioned tuition. Tuition is out of control because of the failure of the way the system is. Mm-hmm. And it's terrible that blacks can't afford it, but it's bone crushing and it shouldn't be for anybody. But it's like so much of it is broken. And it sounds like we're trying to be on the same level, but in a broken system. It's, I don't know. It's bad,
Thank you, Mike. And again, we are going to continue with our solutions discussion. We just started on reparations. We are going to continue next week going down some of the solutions. So there are more solutions, definitely. And I completely agree that whatever the scenario you look at, only God, trusting God and his way is the best way out of this. Louis, any thoughts you have on this? This is obviously an issue that is real. And do you have any thoughts on it?
I do. First, Mike, I appreciate your answer because you know what? Sometimes the right answer is I don't know because it's so complicated that I originally said when we first started talking about this about a dollar figure, just doesn't make sense. But then my good sister Joyce brought out a number. And I saw everybody's faces light up when she said 97 trillion. But me being the numbers guy that I am, I did a little bit of math. And 97 trillion spread over 30 years is only 3.2 billion, which is not a lot of money. Actually, it's less than what we spend on our military. It's less than the prison industrial system. So it's actually doable. That $97 trillion is actually doable. So I thought about it a little bit, and feeding off of what everybody else was saying, it gave me some great ideas of what we could actually do with this $97 trillion spread over 30 years. Because I think Jay said it most eloquently. It's not about the present. It's not about us today. It's really about how do we make it better for our children? Because look, we're all grown. What we've gone through. I don't think that anything, an apology is going to be nice, and it will definitely help with the healing and everything like that. But I'd like to see the system change to allow my children and my children's children not have to deal with that. Mm-hmm. Get a chance to get a little equality and catch up with those that didn't have to go through those hurdles. So with that 97 trillion, some of the things that you can do, SBA loans, so Blacks can start businesses. You could have tuition. And what I mean by tuition, that will cover college, whether it's even 2 years of college, a portion of college, or just a straight 4 years, or depending on how much the money goes into masters as well. I don't know. We could figure out those numbers but it covers college, trade, job training with corporate sponsorship. Because we could do all the training we want to, but if these corporations, as was said by Joyce, are throwing out those resumes just because of a name, what's the point of all the training? So if we could get some corporate sponsorship, because we know these corporations definitely benefited from slavery. Mm-hmm. So they can have some accountability as well if we can get some corporate sponsorship where they go through job training program after going through college, after going through trade schools, so we know that there's jobs in place for these individuals who are qualified, obviously, to do these jobs. Um, Another thing that we could do is something as simple as, and people take this for granted, but don't realize this, but supermarkets within urban communities. A lot of people don't realize there are no supermarkets in a lot of urban communities, which means they don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables that a lot of us take for granted. Medical services, somebody brought up about hospitals. Hospitals are costly, and the way our healthcare system, that's a money loser. So I don't know about a hospital, but how about just good medical services? We have popping up right now, Medi services, where it's you could walk in, walk out medical services and get everything done. Get those in a lot of urban areas, low income areas. That would solve a lot of issues. And another thing is just evening out the taxes for school systems in this country. The way the schools run is based off your tax bracket. So obviously, if you're in a low income area, you have low taxes, which means you have less resources. So we can augment some of those low taxes with some of this part of this 97 trillion to bring back and allow us to have updated books, allow us to not have schools with asbestos still in them, allow us to have, internet within that school system so they can actually teach in a modern era. So there's a lot of things that we can do, and we're not talking about a large amount of money that's going to break anybody's bracket. 3.2 billion is, we spend that on a lot of wasteful things right now, every single year. So we're really not talking about a lot of money that is going to, all of a sudden tax the population. But at the same time, I'm with Mike here. Give the government, whether it's local, federal, I'm not too sure about that. Even with the giving the school system, offsetting the taxes with the school systems. Perfect example, I forget which uh, rapper it was, but he gave $1 million to, I believe, the Chicago school system, and I don't think any of those kids seen one dime. So that's the part that we run into some difficulties, because we have to be honest and very realistic about things and say the government is corrupt, the government is broken. And again, our brother Ron talked about Conyers and the reparation bill. Just to look at it, that was denied by both Republicans and Democrats. So let's not, say, throw shade and say, oh, it was one side. Over 30 years, it was controlled by two parties, and no one wanted to take a look at it. So, there's even if we could come up with the money, there's difficulties in how do we process that money without it being stolen. Um, and that's where the difficulties gonna come in. And I think we're gonna to have some hard set rules on how funds are distributed and some hard set penalties on corruption, where it's not, you're not doing white collar crime time, you're doing some severe, you got to break some rock time, for trying to steal this money or maneuver this money or embezzle this money in any shape or fashion. So there's definitely things that we have to have a real conversation about, because I'm not confident in the government one bit. I'm with Mike on that 100%. They're corrupt, and they're both Democrat, Republican. They're both corrupt and about their own corporate greed. So
now, this has been a very helpful conversation. And for those who are listening to us out there, you see, you never give up. Don't throw up your hands and walk away and think, we're going to break down. Don't get angry. This conversation has been tremendously constructive and helpful. As you've seen, we walked away from just cash reparations. And again, we're not saying that that is not a possibility. We were looking at more constructive options that will provide a solution going into the future to remedy what is happening in the past. We can go back, but we can do something today to restructure the wrong systems, you know, and change things so that going into the future, there can be a hope. So I encourage you to hang with us. We're going to continue to discuss more solutions in the weeks ahead. This is definitely one solution, and I'm going to check in with our audience. We have plenty of comments from our audience. Vilma Davis, hi Vilma, she says cash payments are not the way to go. There you go. There you have that comment. And Shante McCormick says, I haven't decided how I feel about reparations, so I'm here more to hear the different ideas. But I can definitely see how it's also an acknowledgement on behalf of the country towards the group that was wronged. I don't know that an honest apology was ever really received. And that was the same thing that Joyce said. Joyce said, you know, again, that is at least the place to start. And as we saw in Asheville, North Carolina, Ron indicated to us that that is where they started, with an acknowledgement of the wrong done. Shante continues, she says, what groups have received reparations from the US thus far? Native Americans, Japanese, are there others that have received reparations? Can we determine why African Americans, slaves and their descendants have been overlooked? What's the real reason? We have a few minutes. I know that yes, Japanese have received reparations. You know, anybody can throw at any other groups that have been given reparations?
Survivors of the Holocaust. If you go back in history, after World War II, the United States rejected accepting Jews. And so there is a reparation to this day. I believe they're still awarded $5 million annually.
There you go. So you have those, and you know, reparations that have been paid by this country for wrongs done by the nation. Shante, continue. Sorry, go ahead.
No, as far as I'm aware, Native Americans have not received any reparations.
So Native Americans haven't. And Shante continues, she says, Irish slaves were mentioned. Irish slaves, or do you mean Irish indentured servants? I've only heard of the Irish being indentured servants or indentured workers in the US, not slaves. Am I wrong about this? I think, Joyce, you mentioned that, right? So were you talking about slaves or indentured servants?
No, I was actually talking about slaves. In New England, there was actually, there were a bunch of Irish that were actually slaves. But it wasn't generational. It wasn't all those other things. I'm just bringing up other mentions, but they're actually, the history is there. There were a few boatloads that were brought over and they were literally slaves. And they were not able to work for their freedom. They did not have the indentured servanthood at all. And so it's a very small amount. It's just, I'm just bringing up, you know, once you start opening the door, then you have like all these other groups that'll say, and I think honestly, that's kind of why they're afraid of the precedent being set of paying reparations, because if you do it to this group, then you got to look at this group, and then and it's kind of, not that it's right, but when you look at the courts of law, once you set one precedent that opens the door for more lawsuits, they always happen. So I think there's probably some fear, honestly, which, whether correct or not, I think that's kind of where it comes from sometimes, why they don't want to look at it.
Thank you, Joyce. Again, the point that we need to keep in mind when we're talking of slavery, I don't know how much slavery we're going to have to death to open up doors. But again, like you mentioned, maybe Irish, maybe others, but most of the slavery that I've heard of in this nation has centered around African Americans. So hopefully that should put some sort of limit, right, around it, that is not opening a floodgate of claims. But that's a good point there, Joyce.
Yeah, and I would say, I just want to add on that, it's not I think the fear too they're afraid of is if we were actually have to pay real estate for the land that we now own that was taken from the Native Americans, what would that cost? And then, I mean, I think it's just like a snowball that people just keep adding on and on. And so sadly, if you could just keep it for slavery, I think it honestly, it would still be completely complicated, but it would not be as much as then when you start having other groups and adding on. I think that's their fear. I'm not saying it's justified, but I think that's part of the fear.
Thank you. Let's go on. Shante had some more comments. She said a form of reparations may have already been promised before, and that is the 40 acres and a mule. And we talked about that last week. It was at least being discussed in our legislative branch, never received, sadly. Actually, Shantem, I know that this was actually had been disbursed to some people until when the assassination happened and Lincoln was killed. The vice president who took over was racist and basically rescinded that and took back the land and a mule, but it had actually been disbursed to some African Americans and it was rescinded and taken back. Shante continues, are we prepared to say that African Americans have not received reparations purely due to racism? Is it possible that we are looking for deep explanations, but the answer is perhaps simpler? I don't know that I want to get into that conversation right now. I think it's similar to that question I was asked this week, which is, if it was any other race, would we even be having this conversation? But again, Shante, that would take a long discussion and we don't have the time for that. Vilma says, good suggestion, Ron Davis. Let me suggest that's Vilma Davis. Ron, congratulations. That's a great comment. Hi, Vilma. And she says, I agree with you, Joyce. And Shante again, she said, there are textbooks on desks in schools right now that call the African-American slave, quote and unquote, workers, or call the slave trade, quote and unquote, immigration, and the slaves, immigrants. If you Google it, there are well-known publishers that have to go back and change, correct. So this is all the revisionist history. This is all the story that we try to paper over the injustice that was done. And like, I think it was, both Ron and Louis said that, just bare your heart and confess. Confession is good for the soul. Repentance and confession instead of trying to cover it up. The cover up obviously hasn't worked. It has spilled out into our streets this last couple months. And Aaron says, Ron is right in so many ways. It has to start with education, housing, healthcare, and a safe environment that will strike at the results of systemic racism. I think maybe at the roots of systemic racism. So education, housing, healthcare, and a safe environment is where reparations need to go. Shante says, I don't know is a legit answer. I understand completely. This is hard. Vilma says, thanks for being so honest, Mike. And Aaron says, there were human trafficking of Chinese, Irish, and others in the 19th century. It was a different kind of slavery and not as widespread. Oh, we are completely running out of time. I'll probably read one couple more. Shante says, I once heard a politician dismiss slavery by saying, that was 10 generations ago. In researching my own family lines, I only have to go back 4 generations to start hitting my enslaved ancestors. 1865 and before isn't that long ago. I think it's really important not to be dismissive of such an egregious system of injustice towards a people as that comment was. The generations today still live with the setbacks caused by slavery. Absolutely. One of the things that really hurts is when people are dismissive. It hurts again. It's another wounding, and that's wrong. And that's why an acknowledgement, a national acknowledgement, is so much needed. And people stop justifying it, explaining it, or dismissing it. Let's agree that this was wrong. At least that's the place to start. Daryl, Dr. Jones says, just back in town, so now joyfully watching. Okay, hi, Daryl. Aaron says, Louis, yes, to the tax adjustment to schools. I've been supporting that for years. It creates injustice in education. And Shante says he's talking about Chance the Rapper who donated to the Chicago public schools. I think facing the challenge of figuring out a hard problem such as reparations administratively and logistically is better than not trying at all. Then our children will be having the same "what about reparations" conversation in another 20 years. Absolutely. Let's solve that. I'm going to stop now, two more, and then I'll done. Adaro says, okay, fine. You don't want to pay cash reparations to this. Guarantee an equal playing field. We are not asking for special favors, just an equal playing field. And he continues, okay, if the government does not want to make good on cash payments, do this. Guarantee an equal playing field in all endeavors of life. We don't want any special, okay, it's the same one. All right, I'm going to stop here. Thank you for this conversation. They said having it among Christians, it is the best way to go. Gentlemen and lady, thank you it has been enlightening for me. And again, it shows that we can have a meaningful, godly, humane conversation around reparations without getting angry, throwing things, or walking away. There is a path forward. There can be a path forward. Other countries have found this. Germany found it. We probably can't find it in America. After all, we are the land of the brave and the home of the free. This is where, great things happen in America. We have the intellectual horsepower to do this if we have the moral courage and will to head in that direction. We are going to be back this time next week talking about this at 7 o'clock next Saturday. We're going to go into other areas of solutions like Mike discussed. There are many areas that God has a thing to say and we can get into there. And hopefully we've talked about reparations, but we haven't talked about who would administer it. We all agree that the government is a bad candidate for this. That's another conversation. What would be the best way to make this happen? So everyone, thank you for joining us today. This video is going to be on Facebook. It will be on YouTube and is now also on our podcast on iTunes and Spotify. So you can access it there and let people be able to listen to it if you're not able to watch it live. Thank you again for joining us. And brothers and sisters, good night and may the Lord bless you.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.